was in 1981 where an aeronautical engineer, Glenn Binden, decided to embark on his journey for sport optics, previously working with the Ford Motor Company and in various national projects. Starting with making tritium and occluded red dot sights in his garage, he soon after pioneered a new packaging solution for prisms in binoculars. This later became an aiming solution so thoroughly battle-tested that you really couldn't see M4s without them. Hey everyone, Fresh here, and I would like to talk about the 4x32 Advanced Combat Optical Gun Sight. I'm going to have to make an admission here that I didn't quite like the look of this optic when I was first reading about it. This amalgamation of aluminum, glass, acrylic, steel, various radioactive elements to make this thing glow in the dark, looked like some kind of strange thing out of Star Wars to me at first. And so I automatically assumed that this optic was, more hype or just a relic of the past that people like to don for historical purposes on their clone M16s. It did seem a little strange, however, that this little pipe optic would cost at minimum $1,100 strip naked, and up to $1,500 with some kind of piggyback optic that also had another name attached to it. There were a lot of complaints as well of people getting scope eye, never being able to adjust this to their frame, paying over $300 to get the tritium replaced inside of it, and overall a lot of people saying that they would prefer an LPVO instead. This was an optic from the outside that looked like nothing about it made sense, which is why I bought one. Now the ACOG has a certain glow around it, not really for lack of competition exactly. There are plenty of 4X prisms available on the market, but the segment seems quite a bit smaller than the 3X and even the 5X options. The first attempt that I've seen in competing with the TA31 is Primary Arms 4X Compact ACSS. Let's take a look at field of view really quick and why it's important to an optic like this. Typically, the larger the field of view, the more objects you can see in your vision, and especially for a fixed power optic in which the sight picture is moving a lot quicker via your image inputs, rifle recoil is more likely to get you off target and lost in your aiming space. The larger your field of view is, the more likely that you will still be able to spot the target in your picture and correct for it for fast follow-up shots. Field of view, depending on the number range that you're at when shooting both eyes open, can make the sight picture feel a little bit less claustrophobic, or perhaps the rifle feel in itself will feel a little more open. If the optic is going to take up most of your sight picture, you probably want the field of view to be as large as possible. However, if your actual field of view is not taken up by your optic as much, you probably want something slightly smaller so that your situational awareness can be maximized. Primary Arms' first attempt at competing with the 4X TA31 was their 4X Compact ACSS model. It's a little unfortunate because it's a bit harder to grab one of these models when it's discontinued. Except that it's not. And yeah, I see you there, DS Arms. Don't think that you could purchase the design from PA, pay a little bit of money, make some tweaks here and there, and have your audience not really notice that it's just a rebranded PA. All joking aside, this is probably the closest thing you can get to testing one, and likely I'll be looking at one soon to give you my report. The 4X ACSS has a field of view of 26.3 feet at 100 yards. Since we are at a fixed magnification, however, it's kind of tough to see if this is a big deal. So back comes our normalized eye relief, which is essentially the magnification times the field of view at 100 yards. In this case, it yields a score of 94.4, which is lower than any LPVO you can get on the market right now. But this might not tell the entire story. Let's keep moving on. What I consider a bit of a newcomer to this segment is Falke from Germany. Their CS4-20 is a nice compact-looking prism that seems to support really nice German glass. It's got a respectable 28.6 feet at 100 yards, which yields a norm score of 114.4. To give you an idea, the Vortex Razor 1-6x24 has a 1x rating of 115.2. So this should feel quite a bit more open than the Primary Arms. Another German competitor to this would be the Steiner T432, which is part of a series that also includes the T332 and T532, where you can probably guess what their magnification is. Now, Steiner makes an excellent product in most of their scopes. However, their field of view for some reason is only 20.6 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 82.4. In fact, this norm score barely approaches that of some 3 to 9 by 40 hunting scopes. And this is especially strange because the T332 and T532 actually have much better norm scores than this one. I don't really know what is going on with this 4X. So with a little extra money, what does our TA31 give us? Our 4x32 gives us 36.8 feet at 100 yards, which gives us a norm score of 147.2. Now, not only is that better than any LPVO on the market, this is a similar field of view that you get for a high-end 3X prism. So still, for a significant percentage of extra magnification, you still maintain a really good field of view here. So is the TA31 overwhelmingly the best in this segment? Well, we're not quite finished yet. So for a while, the TA31 was an integral part of the SOPMOD Block 2 program. It was, however, replaced by a 1:4 dual magnification prism known as the Elcan Spectre DR 1:4, an optic that I might review one day. It still yields an impressive 34.2 feet at 100 yards, yielding a score of 136. Again, still better than most LPVOs on the market. We're going to see in a minute here if it was a worthy replacement for the ACOG. SIG decided to attack the 4X ACOG from a couple of different angles. One way that you could approach the field of view of the TA31 is through the SIG Juliet 4 4X red dot magnifier, yielding a field of view of 32.8 feet at 100 yards and a score of 131.2. Still pretty respectable. In their very first foray into the fixed prism segment, a couple of years ago SIG came out with the Bravo 4, a space-age modern-looking optic promising a fairly large field of view. And field of view it had, because 53 feet at 100 yards is absolutely massive, and it gives you a nearly incomprehensible score of 212. Not long after, SIG came out with the Gen 2 Bravo 4, which had a slightly more seamlessly integrated piggyback mount. Its field of view is a bit smaller at 39.3 feet at 100 yards, but it still ends up with a very large score of 157. Both of these beating out the ACOG outright. These two optics would be a great alternative, if they were available, because SIG decided to discontinue both of them after both were sold for no more than 2 years apiece. SIG, great job. And I'm not going to do too much market analysis here. Maybe at the time when they were released, prisms were falling a little bit out of favor for hyped names or red dot magnifiers or various setups using EOTechs and red dots and whatnot. But the fact that these have been discontinued so quickly is a bit disappointing. Another vector in which you can approach the usability of an optic is eye relief. The longer the eye relief, the further away your face can be from the scope, and sometimes the more tolerant the scope can be under adverse conditions or strange positions. Depending on your morphology or fighting style or stance with your rifle, eye relief can play a big part in what your preferences are. The PA4X/DS Bro has a fairly generous 3.2 inches of eye relief. Falcon and Steiner follow fairly closely at about 2.7, which is still pretty respectable for most prisms. Our little TA31, however, is very tight for some reason, and in fact, this has caused a lot of complaints with scope bite for some reason. Again, we'll get to that in a moment. The Elcan looks nicely balanced with 2.75 inches of eye relief. The Juliet 4 magnifier is slightly worse at 2.5, but more than makes up for this with a slightly longer magnifier body. SIG's Bravo 4 has a shorter 2.2 inches of eye relief, and the Bravo 4 Gen 2 does a little bit better with 2.36. Here are some of the exit pupil figures for all the optics. You'll notice that because of the magnification and the objective diameter of most of these, that a lot of them fall within the range of 0.3. Some of them, however, stand out a little bit more than others. The Elcan and the ACOG have a slightly larger exit pupil diameter, translating into a brighter image, especially if it's a little darker outside. I promise to go through the physics of this on a later video, but for this discussion, I'm going to simplify the conversation here. What I decided to focus here a little bit on as well is the overall length of the optic, and really for two principal reasons. A longer optic tends to take up a little bit more space on the upper receiver. Depending on the eye relief, your length of pool, and where it's mounted, one reason you may notice is that if the optic is a little bit too long, there are fewer things you can mount forward back on the rifle in terms of accessories, such as your LAM. With all the new accessories being put on carbines these days for civilians, space comes in at a premium. Having an optic that is a little too short and doesn't have a customizable array of mounting hardware, like Primary Arms' Micro Prism line, and you're going to find that as a taller shooter or somebody that prefers a longer length of pull, that you are going to start experiencing eye box and eye relief issues. If mounting hardware is an issue and the optic is short, it needs a longer eye relief to accommodate taller shooters. If the optic has a shorter eye relief, it needs more mounting hardware such as a swept back bottom mount to bring the scope closer to the shooter's eye. I'm going to go into a deeper discussion in this video a little bit later on. All you need to know is the following. Primary Arms has a nice swept back mount at about 5.5 inches of length. Falca has one of the shortest packages, allowing for a little bit more to be mounted up front, less than 4 inches. Our Steiner is a little bit over 5 inches. The ACOG is a little bit less than 6 inches. The Elcan not being far behind, and the SIG Juliet 4 being at about 4.2 inches, one of the shortest of the bunch. The problem is, you're not going to be using just a magnifier in your setup. The reason you've had this magnifier is because there is a red dot in front of it. In fact, a red dot plus a magnifier tends to take up some of the most space up there with LPVOs. So this Juliet 4 doesn't really have much advantage in terms of space constraints, except that it's removable. The Generation 1 Bravo 4 is the longest of the bunch at about 6.25 inches long. The Generation 2 Bravo 4 finally comes in at 5.75 inches, which is closer to the Primary Arms / DS Arms BRO. Weight is probably one of the most noticeable constraints in this segment. A heavier optic means a little bit more fatigue, especially in situations where you are at high ready more of the time. On longer hikes and rucks, that weight may also add up to accumulated fatigue. As an optic gets heavier, it gets very important where that optic is actually mounted. The further out that optic is mounted on the rifle as a lever arm, the more fatigue and cantilever effect that it has on your support arm on your handguard. The further out your support hand is, the better it deals with that weight. However, not everybody likes a C-clamp at the very front of the rifle. Everyone's morphology, muscle structure, and skeletal structure will dictate what that preference is. Therefore, weight is a pretty good indicator of how handy your setup may be. The 4X ACSS / BRO weighs in at a fairly svelte 16.2 ounces. Falca CS4x20 weighs in at the lightest of the bunch here at only 11 ounces. Steiner's T432 is still quite svelte at 16.5. Our TA31 with mount is at about 14.9 ounces. Elcan Chungus coming in, encroaching into 1 to 4 LPVO with mount territory at 23.28 ounces. SIG's Juliet 4 weighs in at a light 12.5 ounces. Don't let this fool you, however. Anything from a Holosun 503G to your latest EOTech EXPS2 is going to set you back from 7 to another 12 ounces, which ends up being very similar to the Elcan. If you are weight conscious, this is probably not the one for you. The only advantage here is that it can be taken on and off. SIG's Gen 1 Bravo 4 competes nicely with the TA31 at 14.8 ounces, and the Bravo 4 Gen 2, probably the Battle Pack version, also needs a bit of a diet at 22.2 ounces. In order to compete with the TA31, a lot of these prisms need to be considered and measured to be tough. A lot of them claim to be shockproof and even give a G number. Because not all these data sheets exist, I'm going to leave this one out. However, for toughness in adverse conditions, I'm going to use the waterproof standard as the most standard one here. Is the PA4X / BRO waterproof? Yeah, I suppose. The Falca CS 4x20 claims an IPX8 rating at 10 meters for 1 hour submersion. Now, this particular rating has two different parts. There's the IPX rating and there's the depth and time. For example, a rating of IPX7 means that the device can only go through a temporary immersion of water and still work properly. IPX8 essentially means that it can survive a continuous and nearly indefinite time of being immersed underwater. IPX8, however, does not necessarily mean that water ingress may not occur. In the case of scopes, you don't want any water to come in at all. So, there comes the second part of this rating. 10 meters for 1 hour indicates that no water should enter the enclosure at a water depth of 10 meters, and it won't do so for over 1 hour. Let's keep on going here. Steiner spec sheets do not claim any IPX ratings necessarily or explicitly, but they claim to be waterproof down to about 5 meters. Let's skip over to the Elcan for a moment. The Elcan claims a continuous immersion of 66 feet underwater for about 2 hours. This is about 20 meters, the best one so far. SIG's Juliet 4 is somewhat similar, but for about half the immersion time. Is it worse? Not too sure. I don't know about their test protocols exactly, because it could be buried in the advertising a little bit. Let's see what else SIG has in store for us. The Gen 1 and Gen 2 Bravo 4 have an IPX8 rating and are water submersible to about 13 feet. Since there is no time specified here, I would suppose that this is 13 feet underwater and nearly indefinite. Spit it out fresh, what will the ACOG do? 100 meters. which is slightly further than what most of you are shooting on a daily basis. That is an incredible depth of continuous submersion, without any water ingress. Trijicon doesn't directly give any shock or impact testing numbers on their website, but I can imagine with this immersion factor that it is still superior to the rest of the competition. I am still flabbergasted by this. What can we conclude from this exactly? The ACOG has an incredible field of view, but it still has stiff competition. It has the tightest eye relief of the bunch, but some of the best light transmission you can expect. It's one of the longer optics in this particular segment, but it also happens to be one of the lightest. Quite interesting. And on top of this, you can give an M4 with an ACOG to a diver and let him swim down as far as he's comfortable with, and no water will get inside. I'm starting to feel like there might be something special here. When you first mount the optic, you are tempted to bring it out a little bit further from you if you don't know its eye relief. And to be quite fair, this is still quite usable like a red dot replacement. When you bring your eye a little bit closer, however, you are completely swallowed whole and immersed into a brand new world. This thing has absolutely wonderful glass. No discoloration, no chromatic aberrations on the edges, no glare. The model that I bought here is a 2012 RCO2, which is basically an older equivalent to today's TA31F, which uses a circle dot reticle and BDC. The reticle's dot, donut, and 300-yard marker tip are illuminated via a fiber optic. I'm not quite in the desert at the moment, but I can imagine that the bloom due to that fiber optic would be pretty uncomfortable. Under bright and normal sunny conditions, this is just about bright enough for what I need. The crosshairs on the BDC are especially sharp and fairly clear to read, even though they're not all marked. On either side of the circle dot, you have leading dots for objects moving at certain speeds and at a certain size and certain distance. You also have further lead and windhold bars on either side. And because there's such a huge field of view, you could probably compensate for some insane crosswinds and running lead-ins. For me, this kind of reticle strikes a great balance between precision and speed. Delta 34 has a great video talking about the different ACOG reticles that you can choose, but I'm going to give my shortened version here. The circle dot up close works very well for both eyes open shooting, just as Trijicon advertised. And it works fairly quickly for longer barrels out to 300 yards when just used flat as a red dot. Once you get to 300 yards and out, your less obtrusive BDC takes over. There is that big elephant in the room, however. Why such short eye relief? And honestly, there are some design and optical reasons why it has it, but I'm not going to go into this here quite yet. All I can tell you is that based on my shooting style, which is hunched right into the rifle, up close, nose to charging handle and beyond, this eye relief is perfect for me based on the mounting position. I can keep both eyes open with a lot of situational awareness, have my eye in the perfect position without any scope bite, even in strange positions, and have an incredibly clear sight picture for PID and detail management. And for those situations where occluded is a bit difficult to use in certain lighting conditions, or at certain conditions that are further than up close, a piggyback option is available. In the older version of this ACOG, like mine, there are no mounting bosses in the back for a direct RMR mount. So I used this retrofit wraparound piggyback option from Trijicon. Mounting an RMR or Holosun 407 to this, I have both night vision capability and capability out to 300 yards in a pinch if I need to. The chin weld for me is not too uncomfortable to use in this case, and I could switch extremely quickly just by moving my head position between the Prism and the red dot, making this one of the most flexible do-it-all setups that I've seen. As said before, I decided to go with the 2012 RCO2 reticle, which today would be equivalent to the TA31H. Let's see what kind of combinations work at this optic height. If you zero your dot at 100 yards, the BDC lines up fairly quickly, but in half increments. Your 3 line is about 376 yards, your 4 line is 450, 5 line 550, and so on. Can we adjust this to make this a little bit better? Strangely, with M193, not really. You could try something like 60 or 75 yards, but your top post ends up being 400, and every increment on the bottom is in the next 70 yards. Let's try some different ammo and see what we could do. At a 100 yard zero, M855 is a little bit tricky. What if we try a 200 yard zero for the center dot? This actually works out okay to about 700 yards. But the hash marks and numbers don't really quite line up in this case. Again, for practical purposes, we can ignore it and actually come up with a few decent BACs for this. If we were to wonder what our 300-yard line should be in this case, it's somewhere between the top post and the center line dot, 350 being right underneath it. Not ideal, but rarely in real life does everything line up perfectly anyway. In all practical sense, it should just be good enough. Based on these couple of first results in the reticle itself, you're just going to try to bias which end of that range scale you want to deal with. On a cross DMR SPR / carbine setup, you probably could play around through 0 a little bit to favor the bottom hashes. For something out to 800 yards, however, you can get something that lines up fairly well. And for a 4x Prism, that's pretty good. There's some stories about potential war crimes and military ethics because of how accurate these things were in the desert. And when I took some shots at over 400 yards in the snow with this thing, with such a clear reticle, I can sort of see why. So that's some of the daytime usability. What's the nighttime version with nods? Despite the scope being 11 years old, the tritium illumination still works quite well. I can still see the illuminated horseshoe dot, especially in pitch black. If I put the unfiltered goggle on, I run into some problems. In pitch black, this reticle is extremely bloomy. It's not only bloomy, but seems to be causing what looks like a glare in the night vision goggle, which actually blocks most of the sight picture. Under bright moonlit conditions or light dispersed by clouds, this reticle is actually quite usable. Although light transmission is fairly decent through the optic, it's still not enough to make this as usable as an EOTech or your conventional budget red dot with NV settings. Can we, however, come up with a lens solution to make this possible? Using an internet trick that Nurse showed me, I went with a aperture and polarization filter upgrade for the PVS-14, which allows me to adjust the brightness and focal length of the goggle. This does fix the blooming problem most of the time. This, however, causes some distortion in the image as I am moving the goggle around relative to the prism itself. Again, there's a little bit of focal length mismatch here, and it's probably better used for red dots. How's the red dot working with both solutions, by the way? Fairly adequately. This version of ACOG, however, is not what I would call a NV-capable or NV-useful optic. You'd be better off going with the TA01, TA02, and TA06, which do have night vision illumination settings. Piggyback a red dot on that as well, and you probably have one of the most flexible night vision setups, despite the lack of light transmission needed for true magnified night vision shooting. If I were to cite one more problem that may or may not be a deal breaker to most of you, it would be the lack of a diopter. A diopter is essentially a focus ring at the back of the optic, which allows the glass to focus to the shape of your eye. Due to the average age and therefore good eyesight of the young recruits given these ACOGs back then, a diopter was considered unnecessary. In fact, having a diopter ring would probably compromise the waterproof performance of this optic itself. All the various slip rings and grommets that would be needed to make that work would have made this a less reliable optic. What I would have to say is, if you want one of these, be sure to have a friend or a store let you look through one. See, with or without corrective lenses, whether or not the reticle will work for your eyesight. Currently, with my corrective lenses and my astigmatism, this reticle does work for me. I am slightly nearsighted, but this may not be the case in the future. And this may not be the case for everybody. So definitely check this out before you buy it. I'm going to have to emphasize this point as well. Buying these new is not a cheap endeavor. $1,100 to $1,500 is a very expensive price to pay for a fixed power optic. $1,500 may give you the ECOS version, which uses a piggyback RMR and a mount, but that kind of money can give you a very nice 1 to 8 LPVO like the Primary Arms PLXC. This video, however, is already becoming way too long, so I'll give some quick conclusions here. Is the TA31 any good? Yes, but it's not for everybody. However, I can confidently say based on my shooting style, my structure, my eyesight, and my preferences that this is actually my favorite prism. It has the perfect magnification out to 800, maybe 1,000 yards, has a gargantuan field of view, excellent glass, a sharp and practical reticle, nearly perfect setup during the daytime for back shooting, light enough to still keep a light rifle with many accessories on it, And with a tough forged aluminum body and fiber optics redundancy, I would definitely call this the Toyota Hilux of Prism optics. And you're going to be seeing more of this Prism on this channel. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. I'll see you guys on the range.